Hey everyone, this is Johnnie Alexander. I'm here again with another episode of Novelists Unwind, this time with Rachel Fordham, and so happy to have her with us today. Hey,
Thank
Rachel.
you for having me.
Oh, we're
Hey.
so glad. We're here to talk about two of Rachel's books. The first one is called The Hope of, is it Azure or Azure Springs? I'm never sure how you say that word.
I always pronounced it Azure, but
Azure. I like it.
Yeah.
Okay. The Hope of Azure Springs. And then her latest book is will be out by the time you're watching this.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I love it.
And it's yours truly, Thomas.
Yes, love it. What, can you show us both your books? Well, I guess one is for the camera.
There you go. This is the first one. Yep. Came out in 2018. And here's the new one. I just got my copy, so.
Oh, that's so exciting to get those copies in the mail.
I know. It's very exciting.
Rachel, I want to talk a little bit about yours truly, Thomas, because I just was so intrigued by the premise behind that story. And that happens sometimes. The authors I interview, they come up with these ideas, and I think, wow, I wish I had thought of that, because that is really cool and really different. So tell us about Penny, your heroine in yours truly, Thomas.
Okay. Yeah, so she works at the dead letter office, and she actually used to have money and like wealth, and then she ends up having to take a job because of some things that happened in her family, and she's not quite as jaded as some of the other employees there, and so when she reads the letters, she tends to get more involved than she probably should be when she hears about the sad things or the happy things. And then one in particular really strikes her. It's a letter from Thomas, and it's written to Clara, and so she kind of makes it her mission to get those letters to Clara, because they've been lost at the dead letter office, and along the way a lot of things happen.
That is just such a cool idea, though, to take. And this book is set in the late 1880s, correct?
Yeah, 1883.
Yeah. 1883, and it starts out in Washington, D.C., and there truly was there were people who did this kind of work by looking at the envelope, and then, so tell us about that.
So they weren't allowed, so they're the only postal workers who were allowed to open the mail. They're still supposed to try to solve it by just looking at the outside first, but if they had to, they were allowed to open it. They were supposed to not talk about what was in it and things like that, but obviously, you imagine how people, I'm sure they did, right?
Yeah.
So, but they were like these great detectives, you think without the internet or anything, they were still able to, I think they said, if I remember correctly, 40% of the mail that came through there, which I think is still pretty amazing. There online, there was a lot of images of some of the mail, and it would have, nothing, or it would, a lot of times, because you had a lot of immigrants, so they'd kind of write it the way it sounded to them. So there's lots of spelling errors, lots of, or they would just write someone's name. Things like that, and the clues that they would put together, it was pretty amazing. And then also the random things that came through the mail, I was reading, and they would find live animals, or somebody was talking about a box of baby teeth that were shipped through. I mean, just funny things that they would open. And then if they couldn't find a home, they would take out all the valuables, and it would go to the National Treasury, or it would go to auction, and so they would get money from it too. So.
That's so cool, and it's just so fascinating. And then to think that you built this whole story around it. And I read there are still people who do that kind of job today.
They're not they don't have the one big dead letter office. They're like regional now, so it doesn't have, it's not the huge giant building in DC anymore.
That's just
and they have the internet, so it's probably a little easier.
They have the internet, yeah. It probably is. It's like, wow, that's kind of cool. I don't know what I thought now happened to dead letters or letters that couldn't be mailed. I guess I thought they probably just ended up.
Well, I one time got a piece of mail back. It had been like torn in half in the mail, and they like sent me back like half of this letter, like, package. They must have somehow figured it out. Probably went there. Yeah.
So, okay. So that's what the story's about, and it just sounds so intriguing. So I can't wait to.
That's kind of Penny's storyline. Thomas has kind of run from a dark past and is trying to, put the pieces of his life back together.
Oh, wow. Yeah. And I guess
I always like the idea that these little things can connect people, and it's kind of what happens here.
Yeah.
You know,
Really cool.
more than a coincidence in my mind. So
yeah. Well, I am reading The Hope of Azure Springs. We were talking about how to pronounce that, Azure Springs. And really enjoying it too. So it's a little town set in Iowa. And again, I just felt like I mean, you know, I don't want to give spoilers away, of course, but the main character, the heroine, she is just, it's like, oh my gosh, that poor girl. I mean, just as you read about her history, I'm a little more than halfway through, but she was, you just are really hard on your character.
Yeah, you know, that one, I just really felt like I had read all these orphan train stories prior to writing that. I'd actually never read any fiction on it, but I read a lot of true stories, and I just felt like I wanted to show that there was these really great stories and the really sad stories. And it was sort of an interesting writing experience too, because when I started writing that one, I was just in this really sweet spot in my life with my kids and everything else. And then halfway through, my son got really sick, and he actually almost died. So I didn't even work on that story for 5 months. And then I went back to it, and I sort of felt in a small way like I was like Em, because I was trying to find kind of the positive things after going through this really hard trial, and trying to find, you know, joy despite, you know, the things that were out of my control. And so it was kind of cool because I got to listen to some of my own wisdom that was wrapped up in that book.
Oh, wow.
As I went.
I mean, I'm sorry you've even had to go through something like that. That's like every parent's worst nightmare. So
Yeah, it really was. But there was a lot of, I think that we had a lot of little, I don't know, we saw the hand of God a lot. And so we didn't lose faith. We just, you know, just take it one day at a time.
Right. Well, and I'm glad he's okay. So
and it was really great to have something to go back to when I was ready to, and it was good.
I like what you said about learning from your own wisdom, because actually that's about where I'm at right now. I think is probably that, where she's, you know, she's been so devastated, and she's had this horrible upbringing and all these kinds of things, but then she has this wiser older woman, you know, telling her to find joy in the little things.
Right. And I think that I think it's in Isaiah. I'm horrible at remembering where scriptures are, but it kind of talks about, you know, like joy cometh in the morning or something. And I think sometimes our night is really long, it can come eventually. And I wanted to write that into her story, not knowing that I was going to be writing that into my own story as well. And I also really wanted, I didn't have any idea it would be published when I wrote that story. And so I wrote a story with a very everyday heroine in it. And so I have a little girl, so I kind of pictured writing it for her and trying to show her a different take on beauty.
That's really cool. And it's a really good, it's a good story, and I'm anxious to see exactly how it comes about. I mean, you know how it's like how it's going in, so it's good. It's good.
Right.
One of the other characters in that book, and I think maybe then also will be coming back in the new one, yours truly, Thomas, is Margaret, the boarding house woman. Is she in both stories?
Yeah. Okay. She is, yeah.
Yes, I thought. Okay.
Yeah, she's my favorite.
She's kind of flamboyant in a subdued way, because I mean it is the old West, but really fun. And I read this, I think, on your website, that Margaret doesn't listen to anybody else, not even to the writer, and just like, oh my gosh, how cool that is.
Well, it was really fun, because I just saw her as, she was just a plot device originally. It was like, oh, Em needs to go work somewhere. She has to work for someone. And she just kept demanding more and more page time. And in the end, she's my very favorite character from that book. So I was really excited to bring her back. And yours truly, Thomas, actually wasn't the next book that I wrote. And so it had been a while since I had written an Azure Springs book. So it was really fun.
That is cool. And she is. And it is fun when those characters sort of, I mean, they just take on a life of their own. And then they, you know, they're going to do what they're going to do. I mean, I had an experience just last week, and I'll keep this really short, but it was so crazy because I'm on deadline, and it's like I've got to get so many words written, you know, almost every day, and all this kind of thing. And I wrote this paragraph about this character coming into a room, And all she had to do after she opened the door and came in was to go set a bag of, suitcase down and talk to the heroine. And she wouldn't do it. It's like she opened the door and wouldn't come in. And I gave up. I just gave up.
Yeah.
And the next morning, it's like, oh, she's not the one who came in the door. So she wasn't coming in the door because she wasn't supposed to.
Right. It was not the best. Yeah.
Like,
that's one of my favorite parts of writing is just, like, I don't know, when the words take over.
They do. They do. It's like, oh my gosh, this is ridiculous. But anyway, yeah. So you said you didn't write this one knowing it was going to be published. So tell us a little bit about your writing journey. Like, is this the first book, novel you've written, or have you written others that are still sort of hidden away?
So after I have 6 kids and we foster, so sometimes more, but after I'd had my 5th kid, I told my husband I was going to go crazy and I needed a creative outlet. And he just kind of offhand said, well, you read so much, why don't you write a book? And I was like, yeah, why don't I do that? And so I wrote a manuscript, and I actually really love the storyline. So I'd love to revisit it someday, but it was technically horrible because I still, she exclaimed and she blurted, I kept thinking high school English, right? And so someday I'll go back to that. So I wrote that in probably 3 or 4 months. And then I decided to write another one. And just because I loved it, even though it wasn't that good, I loved it. And so I wrote, and I was learning all the time, like kind of being self-taught. I went back and read some of my favorite novels and asked myself why I liked them. And I read things online. I didn't even know there was writers' conferences or groups or anything like that. But
wow.
So then The Hope of Azure Springs, which took a while only because I took that big gap writing it. And so when I did it, I went out to lunch with a friend who's a writer, and she said, well, why don't you just query an agent? And I was like, yeah, maybe I will. So I went home and I Googled, what does it mean to query an agent? And so I wrote a letter that night, and I got 2 requests for fulls the next morning.
Wow, that's great.
And I ended up, it was really bizarre. And I had no idea that was an unusual thing. And so I just with one of them, I didn't know that there was a separate Christian fiction market. Like I've learned everything backwards. And so,
wow.
Yeah, so my agent took me on, and then during that time I wrote the book that is going to be my 3rd release was the next book I wrote. And then I wrote another one that nobody's seen yet, so I don't know, something may or may not happen with it. And then they wanted another one that had Azure Springs, so then I wrote Yours Truly. And yeah, so I got a 3-book deal with Revell, and
great.
Yeah, so I just haven't really stopped since. Actually, I've taken some big breaks. I took a year off when we got our first long-term foster daughter because she just really needed me, and but it just kind of all happened, and I'm learning it all backwards. Like now that I've written, I'm like, oh, a critique group, that's interesting,
No, that's wonderful though that you've just had this positive experience. And
yeah, and I think what I didn't realize is that my whole life had gone to the school of reading, and I just didn't realize that. And even as a kid, I would watch movies and then talk about the plot, I've always looked at it critically. I think I just never even thought about writing because that was something that someone less ordinary than me did. It just like something I could do because I'm just, and so until I, finally thought, well, I'll do it for fun regardless of what happens. And then it just went better than I expected. And I still have a lot to learn.
Yeah. Well, I think we all do. I mean, I feel like I'm learning, just all the time. And hopefully getting better too, growing as
I hope so too.
And all that too. So, but it's just so cool to me that, you just sort of were able to write this really amazing story. And we hear so much for aspiring writers that they have to do this. And sometimes if God wants it to happen, it just, it happens. I mean, it's still obviously you put a lot of work and effort into it.
Oh yeah. I think it's a team effort, but he's definitely a part of it. And I think that he knew that I needed something else in my life right then. And I think he knew that even these stories would help me through some of the other struggles we've gone through. And so I think it's all, and my favorite part of it has been that writing these books has been able to connect me to people I never would have been connected to. And so getting messages from people saying, I loved the message in this book and it made a difference has been really rewarding.
Yeah, that's really cool too. That really, really is. Well, this has just been a lot of fun. I really appreciate you coming on. I know I also read, and I love this because I wrote it down, that you're a bookworm turned storyteller. So we've kind of talked about this a little bit, but you love telling stories to your children too. And
yeah, that kind of is sort of how it started too, because I had been telling my kids stories for a lot of years. And so, you know, and having them love it when he suggested that I write a book made me think, well, maybe I could. It's not so different than writing down what I've been telling. Although I tell them like fantasy stories and I write romance. So I don't know.
Yeah, but there again, like Em, and again, not to tell too much, but she tells stories to these two little 7-year-olds that she's living with. And then knowing that that's part of who you are too, I think that's really cool that, you know,
it was really fun. The fairy tale part of that. I enjoyed that part.
It really is fun. So besides writing and taking care of your family and the children that come to you, what else do you do? is there time for any other hobbies?
You know, I have a lot of hobbies that are dormant right now. But we live on an island and we have 9 acres, so we spend a lot of time working and playing on our yard, but there's lots of beaches, and I think it's taking the kids out to the beach is probably their favorite thing. Yeah. And I don't know, I've just sort of accepted that this season of life, a lot of it is about, you know, I love a lot of things because they love them.
Sure.
Yeah,
that's really cool.
We keep busy.
I bet you do. And living on an island just sounds so romantic anyway, right? It just sounds so cool.
There's a bridge, so it's not too cool, but we like it.
To get to the mainland. Well, one question I ask everybody that comes on, when you're all done writing a novel and you hit the words "the end," what do you do to unwind?
You know, what's kind of funny is I just thought about this the other day, that I've never actually written the words "the end." Like, I've just never thought about doing that. So maybe when I actually do, I'll do something. I don't know. When my first book came out, we took the kids to Chuck E. Cheese, which was I didn't really like that much, but they were all antsy, so we took them there. I don't know. I really enjoy having the lulls. When I'm writing a rough draft, I have a really hard time reading any other books. So I always, you know, some writers write every day. I tend to write in spurts. And so when I'm not writing, I love to just read other people's books and just enjoy them.
I think that's
and not think
Yeah. That's cool too. I mean, everybody has their own little way of doing it too, you know, as far as that whole writing process goes. So.
Yeah, I definitely, with a rough draft, I tend to be, it's like really consuming for me. The I've written a rough draft in 3 weeks, and the longest has been, you know, the couple months with that break in there. But it's like, it's just all I think about, and I don't sleep. My first manuscript, I had a baby at the time, and so I would write until he woke up to nurse at night, which was usually 1 in the morning, and then I'd go to bed. Kind of dive into that world, and I can edit slowly and I can read while I edit, but the rough draft, it's kind of eat, sleep, and write for
eat, sleep, write, repeat, right?
Right. Yes.
Well, Rachel, thank you so much for being with us. Show us your books one more time so that.
All right. Thanks for having me. So there, I guess that order maybe.
You can get them both. Now, is it best to read the Hope book before reading the other, just to get the character?
They're not a series. It really doesn't matter. They're very loosely connected. So.
Okay. All right. Well, again, thank you so much, and thanks everybody for watching. So glad to have you here with Rachel Fordham. So glad that.
Thank you.
Thank you too. Bye, everybody.